The war between the United Coalition of Species, UCS, and the Zorath Imperium had been raging for nearly 3 decades, an unrelenting conflict that bled every corner of the galaxy dry. The Zorath, with their savage tactics and terrifying technological superiority, had turned the UCS into little more than a battered collection of desperate worlds. The Coalition's leadership, once confident in their diversity and technological prowess, had watched as their fleets were decimated, their colonies overwhelmed, and their allies picked off one by one. The UCS commanders had known for some time that they needed someone, to change the course of the war. But the galaxy's most powerful forces, the ones they had relied on in previous conflicts, had all been rendered impotent by the Zorath's biological weapons and vicious battlefield tactics. Nothing had worked. Nothing, except for a single, rare glimmer of hope: the humans. Humanity had made itself a strange enigma in galactic politics. In the past, Earth's distant corner of the galaxy had kept to itself, too absorbed in its own growing pains to meddle in the affairs of other civilizations. It wasn't that humans lacked ambition, but rather that their brief history of exploration and technological development was isolated, almost self-contained. The human race had made great strides with their invention of faster-than-light travel, their advanced AI systems, and their ability to adapt quickly in warfare, but they had done so in a bubble. Now, Earth's time for isolation was over. The UCS, desperate and with no other option, sent out an urgent transmission. It was their last message, their last chance. Help us, and the galaxy will owe you. They didn't even know if anyone would hear the call. Humanity wasn't known for its deep alliances with others. The galaxy had long regarded Earth as a quiet anomaly, tucked away at the edges of known space. Weeks passed before anything came in reply. The silence was deafening. But then, a fleet appeared at the edge of UCS space, cutting through the void like a storm. The ships were unlike anything the UCS had ever seen: sleek, agile, and purposeful. Their design was rougher around the edges, their weaponry minimal but potent. The fleet was human, led by Admiral Samuel Collins, a battle-hardened veteran who had been at the forefront of Earth's military initiatives. At first, the UCS command thought it was a mistake. The humans had never been involved in galactic warfare. Surely, this was a misunderstanding. But when the humans demanded to meet with the highest leaders of the UCS, a certain tension began to rise. And when Admiral Collins spoke, his tone wasn't one of apology or hesitation. It was simple and direct. "We're here to end this war. The Zorath won't know what hit them." The UCS officials, exhausted and on the brink of collapse, were skeptical, but they didn't have the luxury of doubt. They accepted the humans into the fold, despite the uncertainty. What followed was both baffling and exhilarating. The humans didn't waste time on formalities. Within hours of arriving, they launched a series of hit-and-run strikes against the Zorath, focusing on their supply lines and weak points. What the UCS had been unable to do in years, the humans achieved in mere hours. The first wave was a devastating blow to the Zorath war machine, and the shockwaves rippled throughout the galaxy. The Zorath had underestimated humanity. They had underestimated their unpredictability, their relentless drive, and their unyielding nature. The war was about to change, and humanity, for better or worse, was at the heart of it. The first battle was a blur of action, chaos, and surprising efficiency. The humans had arrived just in time for the UCS to stage their latest, most desperate offensive, a last-ditch attempt to reclaim a vital orbital station on the edge of Zorath space. It was a crucial hub for the UCS's communications and fleet coordination, and if it fell, the Coalition would lose its already fragile foothold in the region. Admiral Collins, with his fleet of sleek, human-designed ships, didn't waste time with lengthy tactical briefings or debates. He was a man who thrived on action, and he had made it clear from the moment he stepped onto UCS soil that his forces would not be held back. The humans brought their unconventional methods to the fight, a wildness and unpredictability that had been their hallmark since they first fired up their engines of war. The Zorath fleet, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of human ships, scrambled to respond. They had long relied on overwhelming firepower, positioning their warships in tightly coordinated formations and using their devastating biological weaponry to tear through enemy fleets. But the humans didn't play by their rules. Human ships, while technologically inferior in terms of sheer firepower and size, were nimble, fast, and agile. The humans had perfected the art of evasion and rapid response, relying on their ship's smaller size and the skill of their pilots to avoid the heavier, slower weapons of the Zorath. In their first strike, human fighters dove through enemy lines with breathtaking speed, engaging in dogfights that left the Zorath struggling to adjust. Admiral Collins' flagship, the Vanguard, led the assault, cutting a path through the Zorath defenses with calculated precision. The Zorath commanders were used to dictating the pace of battle, but the humans ignored their conventions entirely. Instead of engaging in a prolonged firefight, the humans focused on sabotage and disruption. Small squads of human ships darted in and out of the battle, planting devices that disabled Zorath communication systems and sabotaged their weaponry, all while drawing fire away from the larger UCS ships. The Zorath, stunned by the sudden aggression and unexpected tactics, faltered in their response. They had assumed that a coordinated, overwhelming offensive would break the humans just as it had broken every other species before them. But humanity's response was one of absolute resilience. Where other species had crumbled under pressure, humans had thrived in the chaos. The UCS forces, reinvigorated by the human assault, began to push forward with newfound vigor. As human fighters distracted the Zorath fleet, the UCS capital ships fired their heavy weapons, making the most of the confusion. The human pilots, with their innate resourcefulness, found the weaknesses in the Zorath ship designs, narrow gaps in their armor, vulnerable points where their systems were least protected. It was as if the humans had already anticipated these flaws, as if they had studied their enemies for years. The Zorath flagship, the Throne of Dominion, once considered an impenetrable fortress, was now under direct threat. The humans' relentless attacks took a toll, overwhelming the ship's defenses with pinpoint strikes. In a final, desperate move, human bombers pushed past the enemy's perimeter, launching a series of torpedo strikes that crippled the flagship's power grid. It was a brutal, unexpected victory. And when the Throne of Dominion detonated in a spectacular explosion, it sent a shockwave through the entire Zorath fleet. The battle was won, but the Zorath Imperium had not been defeated yet. In the wake of the destruction, the Zorath retreated, regrouping their forces. They were not used to losing, and the damage to their morale was evident. They had underestimated humanity's resolve, their ingenuity, and their sheer willpower. Admiral Collins stood on the bridge of the Vanguard, watching the retreating Zorath ships. His expression was grim but resolute. He knew this was only the beginning. What the humans had just achieved was a small victory in the grand scheme of things. The war was far from over, but for the first time in decades, the UCS had hope. Humanity's involvement in the war had turned the tides. But the Zorath would not be so easily undone. For the humans, though, this was just the start. They had come to win. And if the Zorath thought this was a fluke, they would soon learn how wrong they were. In the days following the surprise victory at the Throne of Dominion, the Zorath were on edge, their once unshakable confidence shaken to its core. For the first time in the war, they found themselves scrambling to understand their enemy. The humans had delivered a strike unlike any they had faced before, unpredictable, disorienting, and precise. Admiral Collins knew that this initial success, though important, had only bought them a temporary advantage. The Zorath would adapt, as they always did, but humanity's true strength wasn't in their weaponry or their advanced technology. It was in their ability to think outside the box, to approach warfare with a creativity that no other species had displayed. And it was this creative, unconventional approach that was beginning to define human involvement in the war. UCS commanders were beginning to see the brilliance of human tactics, which defied every rule they had known. While the coalition's strategies had relied on careful planning, rigid formations, and precision strikes, humans thrived in the chaos of battle. They attacked where their enemies least expected, using misdirection and psychological warfare to unsettle the Zorath. A battalion of human soldiers on the ground, for example, would never follow a standard military protocol. Instead, they might create a series of decoys, planting false data to confuse the enemy about their true position, or lay traps that the Zorath couldn't have anticipated, all while executing hit-and-run tactics with ruthless efficiency. Human soldiers didn't just fight. They thought, adapted, and outwitted their enemies in ways that the Zorath were completely unprepared for. One of the most effective tactics emerged in the form of human ghost attacks, small, fast teams of special operatives who infiltrated enemy lines with stealth and speed, sowing confusion and planting explosive devices in critical infrastructure. The Zorath, with their brutal reliance on force, had always believed that speed and surprise could only come from numbers or technology, not ingenuity. The humans, however, had mastered the art of disruption. In one such operation, a team of human operatives infiltrated a Zorath-controlled moon base, planting false signals and creating massive electronic interference. When the Zorath fleet moved in to engage the supposed human force, they found only empty terrain. It was a distraction. While the fleet was diverted, the human team had already sabotaged the base's power core, sending the entire installation into meltdown. It was a devastating blow, and the Zorath were left questioning if their superior technology was enough to counteract such unorthodox methods. Meanwhile, Admiral Collins continued to refine his tactics. He wasn't interested in following the coalition's traditional strategies. Instead, he focused on adaptability. As the Zorath regrouped, Collins ordered his ships to move in unpredictable patterns, cutting off supply lines, harassing Zorath bases with a constant barrage of fast-moving attacks, and retreating just as quickly as they arrived. The humans didn't sit in one place long enough to become predictable, and this constant movement took a toll on the Zorath, who were used to having time to strategize and respond. In one particularly pivotal engagement, Collins led a human flotilla of frigates and destroyers in a series of rapid, successive strikes against a Zorath command station. What seemed like a series of isolated skirmishes was, in reality, a carefully crafted feint designed to lure the Zorath fleet into a trap. As the Zorath ships moved to intercept, they found themselves cut off by a hidden human force that had been lurking in the shadows. It was an ambush, and it left the Zorath scrambling to retreat, their flagship crippled in the process. The Zorath couldn't quite grasp what was happening. Their forces, once perfectly coordinated and terrifyingly efficient, were now falling apart under the strain of human unpredictability. And the more they learned about their new enemies, the more they realized that humanity wasn't like any other species they had conquered. The humans weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting to rewrite the rules of war itself. And the Zorath, with their rigid mechanical mindset, were starting to realize that they might not have the upper hand after all. As the battle raged on, humanity's ingenuity and quick thinking began to carve out their reputation across the galaxy. The Zorath weren't just facing a new enemy. They were facing something far more dangerous, an enemy that refused to be understood, one that would never fight on their terms. And this, more than anything, was what made humans terrifying. The Zorath Imperium was not a power to be underestimated. Their initial shock and disarray had passed, replaced by an unyielding rage that would burn through the galaxy until it consumed everything in its path. The battle at the Throne of Dominion and the continued humiliation of their forces left the Zorath command with little choice but to take extreme measures. They had no intention of letting a small, inexperienced species like humanity challenge their empire without retaliation. To the Zorath, it was a matter of pride and survival. Their fleet commanders, known for their ruthless efficiency and mastery of overwhelming firepower, had begun to reorganize with terrifying speed. They assembled a massive retaliatory strike, gathering every ship at their disposal in a concentrated effort to break the human-led resistance once and for all. The entire fleet would descend on the UCS capital, one last decisive blow to quash the uprising. Admiral Collins had anticipated a counteroffensive. He knew the Zorath would not stay down for long, and he wasn't naive enough to believe the war was already won. But he wasn't ready for the scale of what was coming. The human fleet, still small compared to the Zorath juggernaut, was stretched thin, and the UCS's forces were exhausted. Their morale, though buoyed by the human victories, was fragile. This would be their greatest test yet. The first waves of Zorath ships arrived like a storm. Enormous battleships, bristling with weapons and biological warfare systems, tore through UCS defense lines, their weapons slashing through shields and vaporizing entire fleets with a single strike. The Zorath had learned from their earlier defeat. Their strategy was brutal. Annihilate anything that dared to challenge them with overwhelming firepower, targeting weak points in UCS defenses and leaving no room for retreat. The human response was swift but costly. Collins called for a reorganization of forces. His tactics, while effective in smaller engagements, were less useful in a direct confrontation of this magnitude. With the Zorath pressing their advantage, Collins ordered his ships into evasive maneuvers, scattering the fleet in a series of rapid hit-and-run strikes to slow the Zorath advance. But no matter how fast they moved, the Zorath were relentless. In one of the most harrowing moments of the battle, a group of human colonists on a backwater world found themselves caught in the Zorath's path. The Zorath were known for their brutal treatment of civilian populations, and these human settlers were expected to be easy prey. But the colonists had other plans. They had been preparing for a moment like this, gathering what weapons and resources they could from the UCS supply lines. When the Zorath landed to take control of the planet, they met a resistance they didn't anticipate. Human civilians, led by a group of former soldiers and engineers, fought back with a ferocity that stunned the Zorath invaders. Improvised weapons, guerrilla tactics, and homemade explosives turned the planet's surface into a deadly maze for the Zorath. The invaders were caught off guard, their ranks thinned, and their morale shattered. For a few crucial days, the human settlers delayed the Zorath advance, buying enough time for the UCS fleet to regroup. But even this was not enough. The Zorath were pushing forward, and Admiral Collins knew that unless something radical happened, the tide would turn in their favor. With the balance hanging by a thread, he made the bold decision to take the fight directly to the Zorath's heart, their homeworld. The UCS was barely holding its ground, but Collins was resolute. If they could the decision to strike at the heart of the Zorath Imperium was risky, reckless even, but Admiral Collins was determined. The Vanguard and its fleet of human ships had been battered by weeks of relentless fighting, but they were not broken. Collins knew this was their last chance. If they could deliver a crippling blow to the Zorath homeworld, they might shatter the enemy's will to fight. But if they failed, the war would be lost. Humanity would be eradicated, and the Zorath would consolidate their dominance over the galaxy without mercy. The Zorath had always believed themselves invincible, their power stemming from a centuries-old empire, unmatched in scope and brutality. Their homeworld, Zorathis Prime, was a fortress, a sprawling world of thick atmosphere, jagged landscapes, and heavily fortified cities. It was here that their leadership resided, a council of warlords and overlords who controlled every aspect of the Imperium. Striking at Zorathis was no small task. It was a place few dared to even approach, let alone assault. But humanity's defiance was what made them dangerous. They did not fight like the others. They fought with a desperate ingenuity that turned every disadvantage into an opportunity. Collins rallied his forces. His fleet was small compared to the massive armadas of the Zorath, but they had something the enemy didn't: the element of surprise. The human ships, battered but fast, scattered in a series of decoys across the galaxy, leading the Zorath to believe that the real assault would come from a different direction. While the Zorath were distracted, Collins had quietly gathered a small but elite force, a fleet of specially modified ships, designed for deep strike missions, able to slip through the Zorath's outer defenses with stealth. The strike would be a daring one, a combination of feints and all-out aggression. The humans would slip past the first line of defense under cover of darkness, using their advanced stealth technology to avoid detection by the Zorath's surveillance systems. They would then deliver a calculated blow to the core of the Zorath military infrastructure, targeting their command and control centers, their massive factories, and their key supply lines. If the Zorath could be cut off from their resources, their war machine would grind to a halt. The plan, though bold, was fraught with danger. The Zorath had long relied on their overwhelming numbers and terrifying firepower, and they had never faced an assault quite like this. But Collins knew that it was humanity's unpredictability that had already thrown the Zorath off balance. If they could maintain that element of surprise, they might just have a chance. As the human fleet approached the outer reaches of Zorathis, the tension was palpable. Each ship moved in silence, as if holding its breath. Then the first strike came. A group of human bombers broke through the outer defenses, launching a series of rapid attacks on the Zorath defense satellites. The Zorath, still reeling from the previous blows, scrambled to respond, but the humans were already moving to the next phase of the attack. What followed was an intense cat-and-mouse game. Human ships darted through the gaps in the Zorath defense grids, narrowly avoiding destruction as they planted explosives in the heart of the Zorath military-industrial complex. Their targets were not the traditional weapon systems, but the lesser-known, yet vital, supply depots, places the Zorath had always underestimated. The humans had learned from their earlier successes that crippling an enemy's logistics was far more effective than taking down their massive warships. Within hours, the Zorath's entire manufacturing sector began to falter. Their factories, designed to churn out endless supplies of war machines, began to shut down. Communications between their key fleets faltered. Panic spread throughout the Zorath's high command as their empire began to collapse from within. However, the Zorath were not quick to surrender. In a last-ditch effort, they launched a counterattack. The skies above Zorathis Prime darkened as Zorath warships, dozens strong, descended on the human fleet. It was a battle unlike anything humanity had faced before, overwhelming in both scale and ferocity. But the humans were ready. They had anticipated this move, and as the Zorath fleet closed in, Collins activated the final phase of his plan. A fleet of hidden bombers, laden with the latest experimental weapons, launched from behind a nearby moon, striking the Zorath flagship in a devastating coordinated strike. The explosion lit up the night sky, sending shockwaves through the Zorath command structure. The battle was far from over, but the humans had delivered a crippling blow. Zorathis Prime had been torn apart, and the Zorath leadership was reeling. For the first time, the mighty Zorath Imperium was on the brink of collapse, and humanity had proven itself not just as a formidable adversary, but as a force capable of rewriting the future of the galaxy. As the dust settled, and the remaining Zorath forces limped back to their strongholds, Admiral Collins stood at the helm of the vanguard, his face grim but determined. This was the turning point. The humans had not only survived, they had delivered a blow that would echo through the cosmos for generations. But the war was far from over. The Zorath would come again, and humanity would need to be ready. The destruction of Zorathis Prime had sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy. The Zorath Imperium, once a seemingly unstoppable force, had been forced to retreat, its infrastructure shattered, its leadership in disarray. Humanity, against all odds, had delivered a blow that left the Zorath questioning their very dominance. But the victory, though hard-won, came at a steep cost. Admiral Collins knew that the Zorath were not a species to be underestimated. They were fierce, relentless, and unyielding in their pursuit of power, and though they had suffered a crippling blow, they had not been defeated. The Zorath would rise again, and when they did, they would come with even greater fury. In the aftermath of their triumph, the human fleets regrouped, their morale lifted by the sight of Zorath fleets retreating, their capital world in ruins. But Collins, ever the pragmatist, wasn't ready to celebrate. He knew that this moment of respite would be fleeting. The Zoreth had vast resources hidden away across the galaxy. Supply depots, hidden fleets, and remote fortresses. They had not yet unleashed their full potential. The UCS, bolstered by the human victories, had begun to build stronger alliances with the remaining species of the coalition. The enemy's losses were considerable, but the humans had made sure to keep the pressure on. As fleets scouted and secured new territories, they discovered something even more troubling than the Zoreth's immediate counterattacks, a rising wave of rebellion within Zoreth space. The destruction of Zorethus had created a vacuum, and factions within the Imperium, long suppressed under the brutal rule of the warlords, began to rise. Some saw the destruction as a divine punishment, a sign of weakness that needed to be stamped out. Others, emboldened by the human assault, saw it as an opportunity to break free from the oppressive chains of their imperial masters. For the first time in centuries, the Zoreth were divided, and this internal unrest opened a dangerous new front. Admiral Collins was well aware of the political instability within the Zoreth ranks. He understood that the best way to defeat the Imperium wasn't just by fighting their military. It was by turning their divisions to his advantage. If he could stoke the fires of rebellion, if he could exploit the fractures in the Zoreth leadership, he might be able to accelerate their downfall. The plan was risky. Collins knew that any interference in Zoreth politics could provoke a full-scale war, but he was willing to take the gamble. The humans had proven that they could disrupt the enemy's strategies and expose vulnerabilities. Now it was time to apply those same tactics to the heart of the Zoreth's crumbling empire. He ordered his intelligence teams to infiltrate the Zoreth's outer systems, where the rebellious factions had begun to make noise. The humans would not only provide them with weapons and supplies, but also orchestrate covert operations to destabilize key military leaders within the Zoreth Imperium. Assassinations, sabotage, and misinformation. Anything that could keep the Zoreth in disarray. But even as the humans planned their next moves, the Zoreth leadership, battered but not broken, began to regroup. They had underestimated humanity's resilience, but they would not make the same mistake again. New warlords, ruthless and cunning, began to rise in the wake of the chaos. These new commanders, unburdened by the old traditions, saw humanity as a real threat, not just an annoyance to be swept aside. Their military tactics would be more brutal, more efficient, and most importantly, designed to counter the unpredictable methods the humans had employed so far. In the darkened command rooms of the Zoreth warships, a new strategy was devised, one that would hit humanity where it hurt the most. A strategy not of overwhelming firepower, but of relentless psychological warfare. The Zoreth were learning, adapting. And in their eyes, humanity was still a species too young, too arrogant, to truly understand the depths of their wrath. Admiral Collins knew that this was only the beginning of the true war. The Zoreth were coming for them, but humanity was ready. The struggle would not be won by brute force alone. It would be a battle of wits, of wills, and of sheer determination. The Zoreth might have the might of an empire, but the humans had something they could never understand. An unbreakable spirit. And that spirit would carry them through the darkest days to come. The Zoreth, once a unified and terrifyingly powerful empire, were now fractured and on the brink of collapse. But in the wake of the chaos, a new breed of leader emerged, one that was far more dangerous than the traditional warlords that had ruled Zoreth's prime. These new Zoreth commanders were pragmatic, ruthless, and willing to adapt in ways their predecessors never could. They had learned from the human success. Unpredictability and resourcefulness were qualities that could break even the most formidable enemy. Admiral Collins knew that the war was far from over. In fact, it was only escalating. The Zoreth had begun to regroup, their vast armadas reassembled, and their internal factions slowly coming to terms with their losses. New alliances formed, old grudges were buried, and the Zoreth became more organized and focused than they had been in centuries. With their military and political structures beginning to realign, humanity's fleeting advantage was slipping through their fingers. The humans, still recovering from their devastating losses in the initial phases of the war, had no illusions about the fight ahead. The UCS fleet had become battle-hardened, but morale was beginning to fray. Their supply lines, strained from the constant fighting, had become increasingly vulnerable to Zorath raids. Collins knew that to win this war, humanity would need to play their most dangerous hand yet, a war of attrition. Collins's strategy was simple: tire out the Zorath, force them to overextend themselves, and make them pay for every inch of space they tried to reclaim. But this required more than just hit-and-run tactics or clever decoys. Humanity needed to engage on a larger scale, forcing the Zorath to stretch their resources thin while simultaneously strengthening the alliances that had formed in the wake of their victories. To do this, Collins ordered the UCS to bolster their presence in contested sectors and supported local rebellions in Zorath-controlled systems. Resistance groups that had once been small and isolated were now coordinated by human intelligence operatives, supplying them with weapons, technology, and strategic guidance. The war was no longer just a military confrontation. It was a multi-front insurgency that stretched the Zorath's capabilities to their limit. But even as Collins initiated these operations, the Zorath responded with terrifying efficiency. A new offensive began in the Outer Rim, a campaign led by one of the most feared of the new Zorath warlords, Varrak the Unyielding. Varrak had gained a reputation for ruthlessly crushing rebellions and insurgencies across the Imperium. His tactics were direct, unrelenting, and terrifyingly effective. If he could break the human-aligned resistance in the Outer Rim, it would send a message that humanity's presence in the galaxy would not be tolerated. Varrak's first strike was swift. His fleet of warships descended upon a human-occupied colony, shattering it in a matter of hours. The once thriving settlement was now nothing more than a smoking ruin. Thousands of human civilians and resistance fighters perished in the flames, a reminder to the galaxy of the Zorath's savagery. The Zorath had learned from their past mistakes. They no longer underestimated their enemy. They were now intent on wiping humanity out entirely. But this new brutality only served to galvanize the human resolve. The loss was catastrophic, but it was also a turning point. The UCS forces, now battle-hardened and fueled by a desire for vengeance, rallied in the wake of the slaughter. Collins understood that this was the moment where humanity could either break or become something stronger. His next move would need to be decisive. Meanwhile, as the Zorath pressed their offensive, cracks began to form within their ranks. The new warlords, who had once seemed united in their drive for conquest, now found themselves at odds. Varrak's tactics were efficient, but his obsession with total destruction was beginning to alienate the Zorath's allies. Some factions, tired of the unrelenting slaughter, began to question whether their empire was worth fighting for. The pressure from internal dissent, coupled with the human resistance, was creating a tipping point. The Zorath Imperium might have vast resources, but it had never dealt with this level of internal strife before. For the first time, the Zorath leadership wasn't just fighting against humanity. It was fighting against itself. The Empire, once a symbol of invincibility, was beginning to show signs of rot from within. The humans, though battered, were making their mark not just through military strength, but through their ability to exploit these fractures, turning them into opportunities. The war had reached a critical juncture. Humanity was not yet victorious, but they had proven that they could endure. As Admiral Collins watched the Zorath fleet maneuver in the distance, he understood the stakes. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the future of the galaxy. The Zorath, for all their might, were beginning to understand something they had never considered before. Humanity was not something they could simply crush. They were a force that, once awakened, could never be extinguished. The question now was, would humanity's resilience be enough to shatter the Zorath once and for all? The tide of war had turned. The Zorath Imperium, once a juggernaut of ruthless power and domination, was now teetering on the brink of collapse. The relentless offensive by Admiral Collins and the UCS had struck at the very heart of the Zorath's war machine, and the growing internal dissent within their ranks was causing fractures that no one had predicted. The humans had fought fiercely, showing a resilience that had shaken the galaxy's most fearsome empire to its core. Yet, despite the setbacks and the growing fractures within the Zorath leadership, the war was far from over. Admiral Varric, the Zorath commander who had once been hailed as the unstoppable force of the Imperium, had become the symbol of their resolve. His unyielding nature, combined with the terror his forces invoked, had made him a beacon for the remaining loyalists within the Zorath. He was determined to drive humanity from the galaxy, no matter the cost. The final confrontation was set to take place on the fringes of the galaxy, in a system known as Vulture's Rift, an ancient battlefield where the Zorath had once destroyed an entire fleet of their enemies. It was a desolate, treacherous region of space, where gravitational anomalies and asteroid fields created an ideal environment for ambushes and surprise attacks. The humans had no choice but to face the Zorath here, for Vulture's Rift was the Zorath's last stronghold in the region, and they had already begun fortifying it. The UCS fleet, though smaller, was no longer the disorganized force it had once been. The humans had fought side by side with their allies from across the galaxy, forming a united front that no longer relied solely on brute force, but on strategy, intelligence, and unparalleled ingenuity. Collins knew that the key to victory lay in exploiting the Zorath's overconfidence. Their empire, still reeling from internal rebellion, was vulnerable. The battle began with an eerie silence. The two fleets, Zorath and human, circled each other, waiting for the first strike. Varric's fleet, a massive armada of warships and dreadnoughts, loomed like a dark cloud on the horizon. The Zorath had drawn the humans into a trap, intending to crush them with overwhelming firepower. But Collins had anticipated this move. He had lured the Zorath into Vulture's Rift, where their heavy ships would be vulnerable to the unpredictability of the environment. As soon as the Zorath fleet closed in, the humans struck with precision. A series of well-coordinated hit-and-run attacks caught the Zorath off guard. Small human ships, equipped with the latest stealth technology, darted in and out of the asteroid fields, targeting vulnerable areas of the Zorath ships, engine rooms, weapon silos, communication relays. Each strike was quick, surgical, designed to sow chaos and confusion among the Zorath ranks. But Varric was no fool. He quickly realized the human strategy and unleashed his own countermeasures. The Zorath began to adapt, deploying hunter-killer squads of smaller, faster ships to track and destroy the human vessels. The battle raged across the rift, a deadly dance of ambushes, feints, and evasions. The space around them became a maze of debris, ships darting in and out of the treacherous asteroid field, while the remains of destroyed ships lit up the void in a brilliant display of destruction. Amid the chaos, Collins made his move. He deployed the UCS's final secret weapon, an experimental quantum bomb designed to disrupt the Zorath's fleet-wide communications. With this device, the humans could sever the Zorath's coordination and cause confusion within their own ranks. The bomb was launched, aimed at the heart of the Zorath's command structure, and detonated with a blinding flash. For a moment, everything went dark. When the light returned, the Zorath fleet was in disarray. The coordinated strikes that had once made them so formidable were now a jumbled mess of disjointed units. Their leaders struggled to regain control, but the damage had been done. The UCS fleet, now freed from the Zorath's grasp, launched a final, all-out assault. Varric, ever the fighter, refused to surrender. His personal flagship, the Unyielding, a massive dreadnought bristling with weapons, plunged into the heart of the human forces, determined to break their line and strike fear into their hearts. The battle between the Unyielding and the UCS's flagship, the Vanguard, was a clash of titans. The ships exchanged broadsides, their weapons lighting up the darkness of space as both commanders pushed their vessels to the limit. But it was the humans who prevailed. With a final, well-placed strike from the Vanguard, the Unyielding exploded in a fiery burst, and with it, the last vestiges of Zorath command. The remaining Zorith forces, leaderless and shattered, began to retreat, their once mighty fleet collapsing under the weight of their defeat. Admiral Collins watched as the Zorith, broken and scattered, fled into the void. The war was over. Humanity had won. But victory came at a heavy price. The cost in lives, resources, and years of war had been immeasurable. As the remaining human fleets began to regroup and rebuild, Collins stood at the helm of the vanguard, his face etched with the scars of battle. The galaxy had been forever changed, and humanity had proven that even against the most overwhelming odds, they could rise to the challenge. The Zorith Imperium had been shattered, but Collins knew that the future was uncertain. There would always be new threats, new challenges, but humanity had proven something more important than just survival. They had proven that they could fight for something greater, that they could secure their place in the galaxy. The war was over, but the story of humanity had only just begun.